Welcome to a special edition of Theater Talk. I'm Ed Shopes. Co-host Ann McBride and I are here today to tell you about a special fundraiser that's happening at the Pentacle Theatre this weekend. Terra Nova, directed by Scott Ramp, had to shut down last summer at Pentacle Theatre, just shy of its final weekend. But due to popular demand, it's back for 3 performances only, February 9th at 7:30 p.m. and February 11th at 2 p.m. and 7:30 p.m.
Coming up next is an extended interview with Scott Ramp, the director of Terra Nova.
We recorded this interview in April with Scott.
We interviewed Scott ahead of auditions for his show.
We're here with Scott Ramp, the director of Terra Nova. Scott, I understand that Terra Nova is a passion project of yours.
It certainly is, and it's a play that I first performed in as a younger actor back in my late 20s. It was only the 3rd production ever done of the play. It's just something that I have loved forever. And in 2012, I got a chance when I was teaching at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts, I got a chance to direct a full-length production of it for their grad plays. This time I actually get to cast it with people of the actual age, and some of our technologies with lighting and other things have improved since then. So I'm really looking forward to putting this on at Pentacle.
Tell us about the play.
Well, the play itself is based on the true story of the British Antarctic exploration. In the winter of 1911 and 1912, 5 Englishmen and 5 Norwegians raced each other to the bottom of the earth. Only the Norwegians returned. This is the story of the Englishmen. I mean, it's a true story, but it's told in a very poetic, a little avant-garde way, because the 5 men in the Polar Party, that you see all the gritty realism of what they go through. The way I've kind of described my take on this is that the set itself will be very representational, kind of avant-garde. The props and the costumes are so grittily realistic that even, the little bottles of morphine in the kit has labels on it, and everything looks aged and weathered. And then the play itself is kind of poetic. So we've got a combination of realism, a very impressionistic look, and then we've got the poetry. And I think they blend together beautifully.
Wow.
The last time I chatted with you recently, you were on your way back from Los Angeles picking up the props. Tell us a little bit about what you're bringing to contrast the surreal set to the real props in this show.
Well, I was fortunate when I was asked to direct Terra Nova in 2012. I had several weeks of pre-production before my actors were even cast. And in that time, I was going to do a makeup show in London. And while I was going to be in London, the British Natural History Museum was doing a 100th anniversary of the British Antarctic exploration.
Wow.
So I literally spent 2 days absorbing it all, pictures, artifacts. For the 100th anniversary, they pulled out all the stops. And over a period of about a month, I built all of the props and aged them. And I would find things like an antique sextant or an antique theodolite, which is a surveyor's tool, which are used in the show. And I built the entire thing to the specifications of the books that I picked up at the British Natural History Museum. And I stored them at my place in Pasadena for years. And then when I moved up here, I didn't have a space for it. So a friend of mine was holding it at his house. And so I went down about a week and a half ago, and I flew down, drove back up with all of my props, and was pleasantly surprised because I'd forgotten how much I had actually made. And there's prop food, there's the cookers, everything that is used is very, very historically accurate, sometimes down to the minute little details.
Including the sled that is accurate for the period.
And it's used, and it's actually pulled by the actors on stage.
It's so lucky that you were in London for that exhibit.
It was just fascinating to actually see it. I mean, I got to see physically his diary and the last page that he wrote as he was freezing to death. And it gave me a whole different take on the play than I had 20 something years earlier. And now with the pandemic and us coming back out of all of this, it has a different vibe to it, because there's all this stuff having to do with loneliness and the isolation. And there's also even things that would kind of fit into our, diversity, equity, inclusion aspect of things, in the fact that you realize we didn't think about this in 2012, let alone the 70s or early 80s when it was written. But now the whole term of white privilege, you see that these British men thought that they, just because they were who they were, they could make this work. And it didn't, calling the Norwegian a barbarian because of how they went and what they did. And, it's just, there's a lot of neat things that a 2022 audience is going to pick out of this.
Yeah.
So let's compare and contrast the two expeditions. The story is told through the 5 members of the Scott's expedition, and also scenes that where Scott is talking to Amundsen. There's some fundamental reasons why Amundsen succeeded where Scott failed.
First of all, Amundsen was originally going to go to the North Pole, and Scott was going to go to the South Pole. It was not intended as a race. Scott wanted to look at it as a scientific journey. Amundsen, being from Norway and being somebody who was so obsessed with the North Pole, he wanted to do it for more of an exploration reason. So as soon as he was sailing toward the North Pole, the word came out that either Perry or Byrd may have, and as it turns out, neither of them did, discover the actual North Pole. He turned around and headed south. When he got to New Zealand, he sent Scott a telegram. He said, "Captain Scott, beg leave to inform you, heading south, Amundsen." That's all it said. And so at that point, Scott knew that there was going to be a competition. Well, Scott set up his camp in the same place he had set up his 1901 expedition. Amundsen took a brand new, uncharted way. He went to the complete other side of the Ross Ice Shelf, which he had no way of knowing at the time, but ended up being 80 miles closer to the pole. He also decided that he would not take the same path that Scott did. He tried an entire new way, which could have failed, but it didn't. Amundsen took dogs. Amundsen's people were all Norwegian. They were very familiar with cold weather and skiing and proper, acclimatization and the clothing. And Scott's people were not. And so not only did Amundsen get a couple days extra head start, but it made a world of difference. And so Amundsen's people got to the pole 35 days before Scott. And we see that in the play too. And it's where all the stuff starts turning around. It's the end of the first act. And then the second act, everything starts going downhill, which is what kind of happened in real life.
Scott actually came within not a great distance of actually surviving the return trip.
The whole group of Scott's people spent the previous year going out in teams and laying what they called depots. And those were like buildings that had food and fuel and different things like that. The largest one was what they called 1-ton depot. And 1-ton depot was still about 100 miles from base camp, but it was the largest one. And technically, the relief party would meet them at 1-ton depot, and then they could all come back together, because they knew that the 5 on the polar party would be exhausted after having to hike back 800 miles. And they got trapped by a blizzard, literally 11 miles from 1-ton depot. They were 11 miles from safety, from the relief party, from food, from fuel, from everything else. And that's where they died. So they essentially, if you think about it, they marched 800 miles to the pole and then marched 789 miles back and died within 11 miles of safety. That's part of what made this, the whole vision of this so poetic to the British people, is how close they came, almost more so than if they had actually gotten there and came back alive.
It's a story of trial and tribulation. And like you say, the success is the legend that lives on of what Scott and his team had to deal with, rather than just being the first.
Wow.
as we're kind of talking about this, you think to yourself, oh my gosh, we're going to see a play where all these people die. But at the same time, there's a lot of humor in here too. There's quintessentially British. So it was that stiff upper lip type of thing. And some of it is almost a little hilarious if you think about it in today's world. And they followed British protocol. The military members either had to be clean shaven or they could have a beard. So one person had a beard and the rest of them shaved, in 40 below, 60 below weather. This is all part of how different this was then. Obviously, when you see the character of Amundsen with his furs and his boots and all these things, and then you see Scotsmen with their canvas layers of clothing and boots that have very little fur to them, and they're man-hauling. They literally felt that the man pulling the sled was more noble than being pulled by dogs. And so the nobility is essentially what ended up killing them. And for, almost 100 years, the British people looked at this as just a hero story. It was only about the time that Terra Nova was written when people started going, maybe this wasn't just heroic. Maybe this was a little bit arrogant. These people were products of their time. This was Edwardian England. It was right after Queen Victoria had passed, and it was a very different time, and it was just before World War I. So it's a really interesting snapshot in time.
So tell us a little bit, Scott, about the characters.
There are 6 men and 1 woman in the show. And the way I've got it broken down is because I'm actually casting actors that are maybe a little bit older than the characters, because when you look back at some of these photos, it's amazing to see how old or weathered some of these people looked. And this is because of the life they were leading too. The lead, obviously, the one central character, because he literally is on stage the entire time, with the exception of one 15-second moment. And that's the actor that's going to play Captain Robert Falcon Scott, over 35, strong, determined leader of the British expedition, hides his insecurities and doubts. He fears irrelevance. Then Roald Amundsen is confident, imposing, and eloquent leader of the successful Norwegian expedition, appears only to Scott as both his nemesis and his confessor. Ironically, he had very little accent in real life. I mean, it was a little bit of a clipped Norwegian accent, which is easy enough to do, but he also gets to pretend to be British at the beginning. And then there's this fantasy scene at the beginning of Act 2 where he actually plays a French waiter. The actor playing Amundsen is probably the second largest role. Kathleen was a very famous sculptor, and she was very ahead of her time. Scott's wife is the one person who sees through his facade, powerful, passionate, and dynamic. Kathleen was a very powerful character, and you see several different scenes with her, including a flashback of when she first met him. And it's literally a verbal tennis match of her sort of insulting him and teasing him and having fun with him and him getting upset. And it's a really fun scene. So like I said, the play itself has levity in it. And then the other 4 characters are the rest of the polar party that went along with Scott. Captain Oates was the one cavalry op. The rest of them were all Royal Navy. Dr. Wilson was Scott's best friend. He was also an amazing artist. Bertie Bowers, or Henry Bowers, is the youngest of the troop. And Edgar Evans is the only member of the troop that is not an officer. He was an enlisted man. He was a chief petty officer.
It sounds like great opportunities for actors.
Part of the thing that has been a passion for me all the way along is every single person who has been in a production of this just loves it, remembers it. And it's rare that you find a play that gives the actors that ability, but also then sticks with you.
So you're offering the opportunity to not only be in a play, but a life-changing experience.
That's how I'd like to look at it.
Thank you very much, Scott, for joining us.
You're very welcome.
Thank you, Scott.
Thank you, Ann.
Sounds like a lot of fun.
It's going to be amazing. I promise.
The cast of Terra Nova includes Chris Benham as Robert Falcon Scott, Tim Jaeger as Roald Amundsen, Kayleen Capes as Kathleen Bruce Scott, Tavis Brown as Lawrence Titus Oates, Robert Sim as Edward Wilson, Zach Defoe as Henry Birdie Bowers, Ken Hermans as Petty Officer Edgar Taff Evans. For tickets, go to pentacletheatre.org.
It's time to wind up this week's Theater Talk program. Thank you for listening. Next week at 9 a.m., you can tune in to Talking About Art with Joel Zack. KMUZ Theatre Talk is a proud member of the Salem Theater Network.
KMUZ Theatre Talk airs the first and third Friday of the month on KMUZ 100.7 and 88.5 FM, and as a live stream or on demand at kmuz.org. You can also subscribe to our free KMUZ Theatre Talk podcast at anchor.fm and on your favorite podcast app.
Tune in to KMUZ on February 17th when Ed and I return with a brand new Theater Talk program to fill you in about what's happening in the Mid-Valley theater world. In the meantime, check our Theater Talk Facebook page for news and updates about live theater in the Mid-Willamette Valley.
And if you haven't yet joined in to support Theater Talk and the rest of KMUZ's great community radio programs, go to kmuz.org right now and check the Contribute button at the top of the page. And thanks. Until next time,
We'll see you in the front row.